Okay, so which of my business activities generate greenhouse gas emissions? Where are they coming from?
Every day, businesses emit greenhouse gases from activities like driving company vehicles, purchasing electricity, and purchasing goods. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol of the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development categorizes emissions into scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions from a facility, such as emissions from greenhouse gases from fossil fuel combustion or coolant leakage from refrigerators. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions from purchased electricity. This encompasses the emissions associated with generating the electricity that comes from lots of different fossil fuel sources. Scope 3 emissions are all of the greenhouse gas emissions, including those occurring upstream and downstream in the supply chain, as well as employee commuting and many other categories. An example of a direct emission you'd measure and report would be the quantity of carbon dioxide generated from on-site natural gas heating in your building. The heat is provided through the combustion of natural gas on-site of your operation. All emissions created on-site are considered direct and are reported under the Scope 1 category.
What about all the electricity I use on site? That also comes from natural gas, but it's provided by the utility company.
You're right. If you get electricity from your utility that was generated by natural gas combustion, there are associated emissions for you to report. However, because those are generated off-site, they are considered indirect emissions. Indirect emissions from purchased energy are reported under the Scope 2 category and often constitute the largest portion of a company's overall emissions.
Okay, to clarify then, if I know my electricity consumption, you can back out the amount of greenhouse gases that went into producing the energy I used?
Exactly. Most companies don't monitor concentration or flow rate of greenhouse gases. Instead, companies will calculate greenhouse gas emissions by applying documented emissions factors to activity information. Also, the source of that electricity generation can differ depending where you are in the United States. There are major differences in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced from burning coal compared to burning natural gas. Or, your energy source may not even generate greenhouse gas emissions directly if it's coming from solar or wind. Even within the same technology, say a power plant using pulverized coal, the efficiency can vary quite significantly, affecting the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour produced. Basically, some power plants are more efficient than others, even with the same fuel source, so these differences must be accounted for with different emissions factors. Furthermore, electricity losses through transmission and distribution also vary widely depending on the region.
What if some of my electricity comes from solar and some of it comes from the local grid? Those clearly have different emissions levels. So how could I report that to reflect my environmentally conscious decisions?
Excellent point. In that case, greenhouse gas emission reporting platforms, such as CDP, would require two values under your Scope 2 emissions: a market-based estimate and a location-based estimate. This calculation would require an emissions factor specific to your location, since regionally, electricity generation sources vary significantly. These two calculations can be used to quantify the amount of emissions a company is avoiding by purchasing renewable energy. These purchases are usually secured by power purchase agreements, or PPAs, in the United States and guarantees of origin, or GOs, in Europe.
What about all the energy that goes into our product itself? We have a complex supply chain involved in making our product.
These are again considered indirect emissions, but they are categorized as Scope 3. Emissions generated from the supply chain, either upstream or downstream of your company, are reported in the Scope 3 category. There are 15 different subcategories under Scope 3 emissions under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Calculating these emissions is a complex and detailed task because of the numerous priorities and processes that are involved.
Wow, that sounds like a can of worms.
Calculating Scope 3 is a difficult task, but by focusing on the most energy-intensive activities involved in your supply chain, we can estimate at least your major Scope 3 emissions. There are some important benefits to quantifying Scope 3 emissions, and we'll discuss this in our next video.